and microphone if you don't want to be in the recording. And if you don't mind, then just go ahead and do that. So there are collaborative notes. We will repost them from time to time in the chat. Please add yourself to the attendance list so we can contact you later on. Don't worry, we won't contact you that much. So feel free to share your email. If you have any questions or want to make a comment, then please either use the Zoom chat or raise your digital hand. I think most of you have heard about this. I mean, this is the last session pretty much. And also, if you have comments or feedback and you think that this is something that is worthwhile noting down, then please feel free to use the collaborative notes. So, as a little icebreaker, please introduce yourself in the Zoom chat, such as where are you dialing in from, what is your work, your role, why are you even interested in grant data granularity, and some fun fact about you, such as what is your random skill Olympics that you would like to win. So are you very good at petting your cat or at chopping onions or at doing crosswords or whatever? So so Katie has already done one of these. Just so you know, I will do one a little later when I'm done with my talking here. And yes, please do that. So next slide, I think. Okay, so let's start with a little bit of a background about the RDA Data Granularity Working Group. Katie?
Sorry, my keyboard is being funny this morning, so I accidentally advanced to, this is the agenda page first.
Oh, okay. Yes, this is the agenda. So I'm going to say something about, well, welcome you guys and talk about the background of the working group. Then we will talk about the final output because we have been really busy last 2 years putting together lots of stuff. And we have a big guidance paper, the link of which should be somewhere in the meeting notes. And we have also some recommendations that we derived that we also discussed in Göteborg, for example, with the rest of the RDA. We have lots of use cases. And then, well, after we have presented our final outputs, we would like to talk about the relationship to other RDA working groups and interest groups by having lightning talks by these representatives. This is going to be rather shortish, like 1 slide per person. We have Uwe Schindler from the Data Discovery Paradigm Interest Group. We have Leslie from the Data Versioning Interest Group. We have Alison from the Data Repository Attributes Group, and Shelley, of course, from the Complex Citation Community of Practice. We will then have something that's going to be, you know, like a discussion or a panel, and of course a Q&A. So please feel free to join in, and then we will wrap up, and that'll be the last session of this RDA that you will be attending, probably. Yeah, so now next slide, please. All right, so where are we coming from? What is data granularity? So data infrastructure is usually built about predefined levels of aggregation. So GIS is where I'm working. We're doing mostly surveys. So we have the survey level, and then we have the variable level. And the variables are like the question in the survey. And what is really interesting is to looking into how we can derive more information, richer information by working with the data on these various levels of granularity. What we know is, of course, that most of our users are interested in what questions are being asked in a given survey. But generally, when it comes to, for example, download or citation, then the whole survey data is relevant. So as you can imagine, this is a topic that impacts lots of different things: data discovery, metadata, access, interoperability, analysis, citation, and lots more. And that's why we have so many people here. The whole group started as a task force of the Data Discovery Paradigms Interest Group. And then there was a Bird of a Feather session at, oh, that's a long time ago, at one of the earlier plenaries. And this is why I met everybody else. And we got together. So the 3 co-chairs are myself, Katie, and Raina. Rena, you need to wave in the camera, or you don't have to. There she is. So, and what our mission is to explore key questions and collect information on how to best support data granularity and to build upon and complement existing and prior RDA working and interest groups outputs. And we set for our final deliverable a set of collected use cases and a guidance document. And we have actually made it to the finish line. So already I think we can be super proud of ourselves. So next slide, please. Okay. So how do we do that? We had three subgroups. One for creating the use cases. It was Katie was heading. Then I and a bunch of other people, and also we had some help from Re3 Data. We conducted a survey in the data repository community that was spread through the Re3 Data mailing list, where we asked all kinds of repositories on how they are dealing with data granularity. And then there was an environmental scan of data granularity concepts with registry, metadata standards, and RDA outputs, and this was what Raina was heading. Again, with of course people from the working group. We synthesized the results from there and developed the recommendations. We discussed most of these recommendations at the RDA in Göteborg with the group. We got some really valuable feedback there. And then we put it all together into a guidance document, and now we're looking to see how it fits within the overall framework that is the RDA, and of course with other groups as well. Right, next slide. I should say that earlier, so. So here they are, the final output. When I say final outputs, of course, nothing's ever really final until it's actually final. We are still in the last stretches of everything. So if you have feedback, we would actually be able to incorporate it. And
I'm just going to switch screens while you're talking.
Oh yeah, okay. So but we consider most of what's in there like it's complete. Like it's not a draft, like, oh, we started and we have 3 bullet points, but it's a draft in the sense that we are like the famous 99% done. So please feel free to go through it and make your comments. There's also going to be a community review later on, so maybe you can earmark that then maybe you want to also say something about the document. And now I see your Google Drive, Katie?
Yes. So I just thought, so we're going to transition back to the slides in a moment, but I just thought I would show you that URL on the last slide where it goes to. So this is, we're going through community review very shortly, and we'll talk about that in a bit, partially because the RDA website has sort of been getting that up and running, and thank you to sort of Rosie and everybody who's been working hard on that. So in the meantime, we wanted to put up an informal version of this to share and to look at. So this is that tiny URL in the slides that you can click on the URL. The slides are linked from the top of the collaborative notes. In there, you can click on the URL and you can look at this, and I'll be sort of showing, time permitting, I'll be showing these particular documents, but that's what that goes to. So now I will go back to the slides, and I'm going to present sort of a brief overview of the outputs, and then we'll transition to Raina and our important guest speakers. And again, really important because as the last point on the last slide that Brigitte showed is a lot of the value of this working group has been bringing together and sort of unifying all the work that's been done by RDA and many other groups. And so there's a lot of, so this is a reflection of sort of building on the work that community had already done and bringing it together. So so instinctively when I went back to the slides, it clicked on that instead of sharing. Okay, all right, so now hopefully you can see the table of contents of the guidance paper. So the outputs are a combination of a paper that we wrote and use cases in the form of both sort of a structured Excel file and some free text. So this just gives an example of our group has been going for a while and has, a pretty lengthy output because it's a complex area. And again, we're trying to pull together things that happen across the RDA. So when you get a chance to look at it, this is the outline of information about the background, the findings, the recommendations, and the details in the appendices. And I'm just going to go through some of these high-level results that were compiled by all of the members of the working group that have been working so hard the past couple of years. But the first thing that we thought we would focus on is the issue of terminology, because there's a lot of debates around, well, what is the right term to use for a particular level of granularity, or even what are the levels of granularity that should be? And that has been an ongoing point of debate in the field. So it was decided that as part of our working group's charge, we would try to tackle this terminology question a little bit and come up with some recommended terms and recommended ways of thinking about things. And the recommendations does not mean that these are the objectively best or only way of representing terminology, representing granularity concepts, but that we need to have some kind of common set of terms, and that we will continue to debate this. We've continued to debate this within our working group as we did our work. As we were settling to this session today and we were talking with the guest speakers, we even got in a little debate about, like, what is a collection? But the broader point of having terminology is that hopefully it will have a common set of sort of consistencies for clarity and interoperability between stakeholders and structures. So in the document, you'll find a number of different definitions that pull on work that's been already done. But the first thing, that big picture thing that we realized at the top level, is that when people talk about data granularity, we're actually realizing that they're talking about two different concepts. So we came up with the names for these concepts: component granularity and dimension granularity. So component granularity is on the left. It can be roughly thought about as sort of a hierarchical representation of data that is cut into smaller chunks or aggregated. So you have, well, another level of granularity that's even beyond this is the repository level. So you say you have a data repository. Within it, you'd have a collection. Within that, say, thematic collection, you'll have various different data sets. Within that data set, the data can be structured as a database or, say, potentially multiple files. If you have within those files, you may have various different variables. And then with those variables, you have data points. And so if you go into the document, it sort of describes what we mean by this, what are alternative terms to these. So that's one kind of granularity, is taking data and cutting it into smaller chunks or aggregating it to larger chunks. But the other type of granularity that we had seen mentioned is what we're calling dimension granularity, which is the ability to measure something at a more fine-grained level or at a coarser level. So if you have, say, a variable about the concept of time, you can measure those time in broad units of measure, coarse units of measure, or fine units of measure. So you can have a measurement of the temperature in the ocean, or a survey about when you last took public transportation, and you can measure that in years, months, days, hours, minutes, seconds, nanosections. So that's also a kind of granularity, but it's different from the component granularity. So these were some of the topics that we talked about, that we settled on. And again, there's no objective, perfect way to name data point versus naming it granule, but our recommendation is to try to use consistent terminology for clarity and interoperability. And again, we can continue to debate these, and we should, but knowing that it's helpful to talk about the terms themselves. So now I'm going to go on to some of the sort of selected results that came out of those three subgroups that Brigitte talked about. So the use cases group, which has credit to many people who contributed to the concepts of it and the results, is I'll show in a minute. We had outlined, and there's a slide later that talks about it, use cases in a structured format for user stories that talked about main concepts of roles involving data granularity. So say data consumer, repository, data producer. Types of use, so sort of roughly related to the sort of phases of the data lifecycle, if you may. and then levels of granularity. And so we had 64 use cases overall, and we can see that the most common type of role coming up in the use case was the data consumer, next repository and data producer, but these other roles, data manager, funder, research administrator, they came up as well. And then the use cases most frequently dealt with findability or discovery as a process, curation, deposit, identification, citation and metrics, access, and these other categories as well. So we have in the paper sort of overall frequency statistics and then some cross tabulations to say, okay, for the data consumer, they most frequently reference the process of findability and discovery, whereas for the repository, that's an issue, but identification is as much, if not more, of an issue, and as is curation. So these tables are in the paper. And another example that we have is, this is an example of the role as it relates to the level of granularity. So the data consumer is interested in various different levels of granularity, whereas the repository is as well, but there's a lot of frequency around this concept of custom subset. So oftentimes we're thinking a lot about the level of granularity of a data set to be able to download it, access it, identify it. And notably, even more often that came up in our sample was this concept of a custom subset, to be able to access something that's at a lower level of granularity than the standard data set, but is not just a single variable. And we'll emphasize that this is a convenient sample of use cases, not a representative sample. So there are probably lots of things that we didn't capture, but this is a snapshot of what we did. And we also have a table that cross-tabulation that looks at the association between a level of granularity and one of these phases. So those are an example of the use case results. Then the survey group that Brigitte mentioned was a collaboration with Re3 Data, surveyed repositories that are members of Re3 Data who responded about different ways that they handled granularity. And this is just a sampling of the kind of results that we had in there, where there was a question asked about the kind of entity types that you have in your service. Data sets was the most common, but when people were given the opportunity to identify more than one type of information, they also mentioned software collections, sometimes publications, metadata, and that obviously many repositories will collect more than one of these formats. But when we get to thinking about granularity, so even within thinking about data sets, we had a question about, well, which level of granularity would you say that the entity represents? A single measurement, a series, a file with multiple measurements, a package of files, which may be considered a data set, a collection. So this showed, and for each of these levels of each of these entities, you were able to identify more than one level and the relationships. So the other category of things that the survey talked about were policies and how data granularity was handled, including questions like who is responsible for ensuring or sort of enforcing the level of granularity in your repository. Do you choose, are there enforced guidelines? Is it more open-ended depending on what the depositor does? So there seems real variety here. And then an important area we wanted to capture is not just the way granularity is handled in a straightforward way, but what are challenges that came out both in the survey and the use cases. And so discovery seems to be a leading challenge, which is difficult for the repository and researchers in their domain, as well as issues of citation and identification. So now we had a third subgroup that did an environmental scan of metadata standards and schemas and RDA groups, looking at what was going on in the field and what are sort of constraints within which these repositories were operating. So there are quite a number of results in there, too many to capture here on these slides, but an example of this is that there was a process for looking through all of these schemas and resources to looking at what are the granularity related issues that come up in metadata within metadata schemas. So these are examples of dimension granularity. So issues that come up a lot having to do with temporal, geographical, or thematic dimensions. Also thinking about a project. So another type of granularity is around the way that you collect the data. Is it a project, an expedition, an experiment? And lots of different issues with metadata having to do with trying to measure the size and the format of the data. So I know this is sort of just at a high level, and the paper will describe things as well. So a couple of final slides before I hand it off is when you looked at these 3 different subgroups, what were the overall trends going across all of them is really the need to try to embed data granularity at a systematic level within the infrastructure. One of the things that we saw, particularly in the use cases, is that the data set still often operates as sort of a primary level of granularity that users and repositories and institutions are thinking about. But there was also a lot of discussion about custom subsets, how key they are, that maybe they require additional thinking about and about support. Granularity in data discovery remains a prominent challenge. How granularity is represented within metadata is critical. And that the way that you try to represent the relationships among levels of granularity, which may or may not be hierarchical, you really need to ensure to describe those well in the metadata, but that's not always easy. And as I mentioned before, originally the need for better consistency and clarity and common terminology around data granularity concepts. And then lastly, something that came up as sort of an incidental finding is the survey also tried to look at the size of repositories, but there's not actually really a standard way to describe that. So something that Brigitte and her group found. So then what we move on next to are sort of our overall recommendations, and these are much more detailed in the paper. But our general recommendations having to do with thinking about, okay, when you're managing these entities, what are some key sets of characteristics that they should have to support granularity? The same thing with metadata, how important it is to have in that realm. Policies around granularity, as we said, and then thinking about particular mechanisms that should be put into place to support granularity at the level of discovery and access, citation, and identification. And the last 2 are sort of broad recommendations that apply to everything in general, is that because there's no perfect, objectively perfect way to handle granularity, institutions and stakeholders really need to think about what are the ways to support granularity that make sense for their organization and their users, and that you should be thinking about that proactively and regularly given a change in concept. And then, as I mentioned, we encourage the field to adopt this terminology as a quasi-standard to foster clarity between different parts of the organization and stakeholders across organizations. So that was sort of the high level for the paper. Then for the use cases, so one of the outputs are the use cases themselves to be able to look at and use. And we developed these, as I mentioned, in a dual format. Within our group, we were trying to capture, because sometimes when people say use cases, those can be represented in a variety of different ways. And so we ended up going with a dual format of one, the user story format, which some of you may be familiar with, that describes a user need in the format of, as someone in a particular role, I have a goal that's designed to achieve a particular benefit. So we wanted to have that and have that structure. And at the same time, we had in parallel sort of narrative descriptions of the use case, because there are user needs or challenges that won't fit into that particular structure. That said, for that structure, we coded them by the role and by the other categories that you saw in those cross tabulations, the category of type of use and the level of granularity. So this is an example of what the spreadsheet looks at, and I might have a brief moment to be able to share it. live, but this is an example of the first certain number of rows in the component of the spreadsheet that's the structured user story format. So each use case has an identifier. Of course, it's linked with a narrative. And then it says, for example, as a data consumer, I want to find data of interest to me so that I can quickly find things for my research, for example. And they may be interested in finding data. Their need is around finding data, and they may want to find it at the variable level, but they also may want to download and access it at the level of a custom subset. So those are the use cases document that I shared before on the Google Docs is in a PDF, but it's also in a Google Sheets format where you can pick and filter these. And I can sort of demonstrate if that we have more time at the end, but I think I will maybe stop there because I want to have really plenty of time for the lightning talks and the discussion and Q&A later. So Brigitte and Raina, is there anything else that you'd like to add before we move on to this next section? I know that was a whirlwind.
We were very good on time. Like, you could have talked like another 5 minutes if you wanted to, but no, I think there was a very good representation of what we've done. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and that's okay. We'll have more time for discussion and at the end, and then we could even pull up the paper if we need to at that point too. So, okay, so for the lightning talks that we're going to start, I just wanted to say that we recognize that data granularity concepts have an interconnection to numerous RDA interests and working group objectives and outcomes, not just the 4 that we have presenting here today. So we just really wanted to invite representatives from some of these groups to speak to the ways that data granularity is intertwined with their efforts. And just as a context for myself, my own deep thinking around data granularity really started when I was working at Ocean Networks Canada and trying to implement one of the RDA working group output from the data citation working group that had recommendations for dynamic data, which is what we had with Ocean Networks Canada. And so I really had to think hard about what were the boundaries of a data set for which to apply the DOIs, and as well in those dynamic data recommendations, they had the notion of subsets that you had to maintain with query IDs and have a query store of the metadata that defines that query. And so that led me to this concept of thinking around these dimensions of data granularity, because those were the types of things that we would capture in our query store, like the time range of the data set, the particular formats, the particular variables that they wanted to have in their subset. So these were notions I was grappling with, even just trying to implement those data citation recommendations. And it was important because with GOIs and these query IDs, these are meant to be persistent for the long term. And not only that, you have to have, when you're working in a data repository and developing these technology infrastructures, you have to think about sustainability as new code gets developed or migrations of underlying architecture get changed over time. What would be something that would be maintainable throughout all the changes that would occur? So that's where I really got my start of thinking about data granularity, and through this working group really expanded all of these notions, especially looking at what were the other outputs of the different RDA working groups. So I'm really delighted that we can have some of these representatives here today to speak to that. So I'm going to, the next slide, please. Is the next slide coming? Katie? Okay, there. Yes, sorry. And I know these were all introduced at the beginning already by Brigitte. So we have these 4 interest groups and working groups that are coming together in one community of practice here today to explore how data granularity intertwines with their efforts and past outputs. So really glad to have Uwe, Leslie, Allison, and Shelley here today. So without further ado, we'll let Uwe speak to the data discovery paradigms.
Okay, thanks. So I put everything on one slide, so it's just a short overview. So the data discovery paradigms interest group is somehow the mother also of this group. So and we are also talking about the data the data granularity, because the data granularity also has an effect on how to discover for data. And the latest output, which is currently under preparation, unfortunately, the QR code is missing here. So you could also look at that. That 10 principles to improve dataset discoverability. And this is mainly those 10 principles which have actual recommendations, for example, for data producers, also data repositories, data seekers, and some data discovery service providers to find data in those repositories. And the specific problem there is also, if you have data on different granularities, it's not easy to make them available, for example, in a single search portal, because the user might see different granularities of data sets in the same search engine and cannot differentiate between all those. And one of the principles is about that exact problem. So it's principle number 7. It's providing linked metadata at different granularity levels. And there are 3 recommendations. So the first one that we figured out is that you should describe the data sets at all the different granular levels that are available. For example, if it's a collection, you should have collection metadata. You should have the item metadata for the specific parts of it, or you should also have metadata for all the variables measured in it, or the related information. And the second recommendation, which is strongly related to that, is that you should supply in your metadata links between those different granularities. So for example, if you have a collection data set which has several childs, there should be the metadata, in the metadata should be the link to the child data sets, or vice versa. So anybody who finds a data set on a different granularity can easily skip over to the other ones. And to also improve searching, you also need to look into a better metadata. So for example, in your search engines, you could include information from child data sets in collections also into the collection, vice versa. So it's also possible to find the higher granularities by entering keywords which are only available in those smaller pieces that are available. And so that's basically, there are some examples from Pangea in this principle 7. So you can also look at how we are handling the those data sets on different granularities. Yeah, that was from my side. I will post the link to the 10 principles to the chat.
That's great, thank you. And that's great if you can post that into the chat, and we can also throw those into the shared collaborative notes. And so just also a reminder, anyone is welcome to add in their comments into the shared collaborative notes that we can maybe come back to also in the discussion. Okay, so the next slide. And we'll do the next talk with Leslie Weibarn for the data versioning interest group.
Okay, so it's a bit of a struggle because versioning is very complex, and I just thought I'd keep it at a high level. If you go to our versioning group, we been struggling with this for a couple of years, even though we had about 34, 35 use cases. Because it's not an easy concept to get over to people. And so we found this methodology called Functional Requirements for Bibliographic Records, otherwise FRBR, which is actually used by librarians decades ago. And there are a few people around who are thinking that this has a lot of, what can you say, relevance in the digital age. And I guess I can see how it ties into granularity. If there is a connection between the different granularity levels of your data. And so what we have is you have a work. So that can be like a satellite mission, and it collects a lot of data in, zeros and ones. And then, so the zeros and ones are the starting, but then you can take that data and convert it into something. And that's sort of level one where you calibrate it and get all the bugs out of the instrument data. And then you take that raw data and convert it into geophysical variables. And then so that's level 2, then level 3, you start to create products and then you create models. But each one of those expressions that I've just said of the data can be manifested in multiple formats. It can be in PDF, CSV, HDF, whatever you call it. So again, that becomes, if you like, a different version. And then one thing we were very insistent on is respecting the librarian's treatment of an item. And so an item means that it may actually be the same manifestation of the data, but if it's digital, it's at a different location with a different delivery mechanism. And in the interests of true reproducibility of science, we say that that is actually a different version, because you never know unless you've got a memorandum of understanding. Something could change from one site to the other. It can be unintentional, or maybe because there's no connection between the two copies of the data, the one at the source data set gets source repository gets updated, and therefore it's out of sync with the supposed copy. And so, I mean, another way of looking at it is like, the work would be Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. The expression is the manuscript, and you can have different versions of that have happened over time. And then you can have the manifestation, which is a manuscript that enables you to either play it at the London Philharmonic Orchestra with a huge, orchestra, or you've got a cut down version that you play on a local Pitcairn Island community town hall. And then, of course, the item would be whether it's a recording on a disc or a movie or, whatever you've got. And so I think it's really getting into this different variables, different ways in which we create from an original piece of work, an original survey, an original set of samples or something, all these derivative products. And I can see how, with granularity, you're getting that different ways of expressing the same data set. So at the moment in our group, we've got these high-level principles and we're trying to turn them into actionable items like, when is it really a new data set? When do you put the DOI? Just these kinds of things. That's a bit like, having the FAIR principles, and everyone's got 51,000 different ways of applying them. We're currently working on turning the principles into actionable items, but that kind of gives you our structure for how you sort out related data sets, which I can see you're doing that in your granularity because you've got related data sets at different granularities. And maybe we need to work with you to see how we can map this further methodology onto what you're doing. That's if people want to. That's it.
Thank you, Leslie. And I remember in an environmental scan that we did, which included the data versioning interest group, or I guess it was the working group at the time of the output for the conceptual framework and proposed principles that came out in 2021. one of the principles was about granularity. It was called Granularity Principle 3. Yeah, I looked at that and thinking about some of the language that was used in terms of works as maybe one way of defining a collection, or the entire time series as being identified as a collection with timestamp revisions. So yeah, there is definitely a lot of overlap with what this group has been looking into. And yeah, maybe still some better joining of the language we use for the term, like the word manifestation I like, for example, but yeah, we don't use that in our own paper. So these are kind of things to think about as one of the dimensions that we're using. Yeah.
I think one of the problems we had was when we started, I think people are changing now that, knowledge graphs and PIDs are much more accepted. But I know when we started, we had some groups telling us, oh, we just have one landing page, we don't, and one DOI, because people were reluctant to admit DOIs at finer granularity because they cost money. And they were just wanting, one DOI for everything. And then when reproducibility became important, people started to realize, and that's why we're very insistent on the item, a different place, you have a different different DOI for it, because if you're doing really, ultra detailed reproducibility, then you have to know which exact version you used. Anyway, better move on to the next person. I'm saying too much.
No, that's great. And we can come back to some of that in the discussion. So next slide then is with the Data Repository Attributes Working Group with Allison, and these are more recent outputs that are formalized. So we didn't have a chance to actually review these in the context of our own paper or our own guidance. But this is something that we could maybe continue to explore and hopefully figure out ways that we can interconnect. So Allison?
Sorry about that, everyone. My teenager's school called just 2 minutes ago, right as we were finishing talking about versioning. So I've just gotten off the phone. Thank you for he was feeling unwell, but he's going to head home now, but it's nearly the end of the day anyway. It's funny how family life intrudes upon work life. I'll give him another call in a moment. He seems okay. Thank you for having me. I originally came to this slide thinking that as co-chair of the Data Repository Attribute Working Group, I find a lot of points of commonality, but actually the more I read in regards to your particular outputs, the more I saw that actually in a quite refreshing way, we are generally talking about different things. But that's not to say that I don't think there's parts where we need to be considering each other's outputs. So Data Repository Attribute Working Group has just finished. In fact, I just got an email today, and I'll share the link in the chat or in the notes after I finish, that shows our output, our primary output, which is an attribute list of, I think we made it up to 17 attributes that repositories should sort of self-describe themselves with. And that's just gone up on Zenodo now. So we're wrapping up the working group and thinking ahead to what might be next. What I saw in particular, the main point of commonality was around your metadata recommendation. And I've just copied a little bit of the rationale here just to make myself remember what I was going to say about it, essentially. We do have a metadata field in the data repository attribute list, but this is more about discussing the type of metadata formats that are allowed within a repository. However, this recommendation is not exactly about that, but it did lead me to the question of should any database level attributes be included around granularity. None of our 17 attributes deals with granularity at all. Now, remembering that, for want of a better word, and in similar way to what we were speaking of just before we started this session 45 minutes ago, the working group output for this is at a higher level of granularity than what you're doing. So we are sitting at the level of repository level attributes. But that doesn't mean that some comment about the types and levels of granularity that a database accepts might not be a worthy filterer or facet that upon which landscape analysis or searching for appropriate repositories could be done. You mentioned Read Through Data earlier as one of the partners for this interest group, and as someone in Fair Sharing who provides complementary service, I think the ability to perform these sort of landscape analyses according to multiple different axes is really important. And so certainly at the moment, we don't capture anything in the data repository attribute list about granularity. So if, for example, as part of this, there could be a recommendation for an update to the list that might include something appropriate at an appropriately high level about granularity. That would be something really interesting to pursue. Then I snuck in one final point with my other hat as a Fair Sharing Working Group co-chair, because we store records, not just about databases, but also standards and policies. And there are a few of the different points that we relatively closely are sort of interested in. This is your 2 and 7 recommendations. We do have some information on now. And I wanted to point out for 3, where you're talking about policies, that Joy Davidson from the DCC has a Fair Enabling Data Policy checklist, where she creates a list of items that people who are creating policies that will to enable fair, making sure they're including everything they did in that policy. But I don't think there's anything in that. And I do recall looking through it, because we implement that in Fair Sharing, that there's anything actually about granularity, and thinking about granularity in the context of policy development and in the context of FAIR might be an interesting extra thing to think about. So I just wanted to point those sorts of things out. It's not quite as tightly coupled as the versioning interest group is that we just had, but there are some interesting points that we can maybe cover in future. Thank you.
Thank you. And maybe we can use the discussion to dig a little bit more into that. And I'm glad you brought in your Fair Sharing Working Group hat. That clearly does have some relationships to this work as well. So the next slide, we'll move on to Shelley with the complex citations unity of practice. You want to go ahead, Shelley?
Yep, thank you, Raina. So the complex citations working group, it actually, before it joined RDA, we did call it a community of practice. So that is not incorrect in what Raina has been talking about. And then we aligned to the vocabulary for RDA when we became an endorsed working group. So that's the back and forth there. The challenge for us is actually a limitation that journals commonly have, including AGU journals. And I have a journal hat, being an AGU staff person, but I also have my larger hat is an advocate for all things data and software, and helping our researchers understand the best practices. So the problem came up. Deb Agarwal was at an AGU town hall a number of Decembers ago, and we were having a discussion on challenges around data citation, and she represents Ameriflux, the FluxNet, and which is a number of towers that have sensors on them and collect data, and each of the towers has a set of PIs. And how do we cite the hundreds of data sets that are used in certain types of research? And they ended up having to do a data paper, and the moment that data paper is submitted, it's already aging, right? Like, because that's a time series data, and it's aging. So it's no longer accurate. You could have a new tower, and such. So we all came together around this, and over time, scrappy group, we hadn't yet aligned to RDA, and we really wanted to not only be able to cite. Okay, the problem. Journals don't normally allow more than 40 or 50 citations in the references section because it's just hard to do. Although I do see that Nature's online here, and I want to call out scientific data. Scientific data actually is much better at doing this, but they are an outlier when it comes to the rest of the journal community. So yes, give scientific data a thumbs up. So what happens is, and even in AGU journals, they'll push those citations to the supplementary information where they're not indexed, they're not discoverable outside of finding the paper. It's just not supports FAIR, it doesn't support open science, it's just not right. But there are production issues for why this happens. And frankly, the journal community is not yet good at data citation. So if you give them 50, 1,000, you're asking for failure there. That's just not going to go well, probably. So we were talking about not only getting all the citations in, but making sure proper attribution was happening for those that had created those data sets. So we were working on this package, a collection, a crate, a envelope, a list, and we gave it this funny, stupid name that drives Raina crazy, reliquary. It's a dumb name. It's meant to be temporary, but we didn't want to go down the vocabulary rabbit hole. And we are designing around this word essentially an index of digital objects, data, software, physical samples, really important, audio, imagery, and in order to preserve and connect to the paper those digital objects that support that research. Now, there's other use cases, but we're focusing on the publishing use case. And what is incredibly important is that the downstream process, so the publication to all of the services that support and enable attribution, and eventually the concept of credit, the construct of credit is enabled. So our connection to data granularity is you are serving up for us a way to make sure we have really accurate citations in this reliquary. So we have a direct connection with you. And I think the way we support your work is we want to figure out how to make sure that the creators of those granules, which are then linked into larger, as Raina was showing earlier, and Katie was demonstrating in her previous slides, all of the different layerings, and that you can traverse that. For instance, the authors are identified at the higher level. We're going to cite the lower level, and you can in fact traverse in some way back to the authors, so the authors get acknowledged for having been their data having been used for that research. Similarly, we'll be able to have more accurate identification of any funder who is connected to that data, of the repository that is hosting that data. So we really feel like we're not only creating this mechanism that will help the researcher be more accurate with the data and other digital objects supporting the research, but we'll actually dig in on what it means to enable attribution. It's going to be more than 18 months. So we're coming to an end on our 18 months in about August, and we'll have to get going again. We'll have to have a revision, a next steps. So please join us. So the QR code is in the bottom right. If you are not on our mailing list, please join us. I think we have incredible relevance with Granularity, and having the team that thought through all of those layers will be really valuable as we're thinking through what we're calling the unzipping. Zip them up, get them through publication, unzip them on the other side, and make sure that we have the right levels represented on the other side. So thank you very much for the opportunity. And if you get the heebie-jeebies for reliquary, I'm sorry. It's really meant to be humorous. It's not meant to be inappropriate.
Yeah,
I think
no,
we're stuck with the name.
I can appreciate that. I mean, I know you were trying to look for just another word that wasn't overused, and so I can appreciate that. But yeah, I think we need to still continue to work on some brand new words somehow, invent them, but how to
We will
make
not
sure they
be
get rolled
able-
out across the community is the challenge.
Yes.
Okay, so that was a really good set of 4 different interest groups and working groups perspectives. So now I guess, I guess we have the acknowledgement section, which I was already just popping over into the discussion in my mind. So yeah, we just for acknowledgements in terms of the outputs that we've had, we have really spun out of the discovery paradigms in this group, as Uwe mentioned, in terms of being the ultimate parent. So that's where the task force started a few years ago and ultimately led to this working group. And there's also been corresponding work happening with groups like ESIP. We've had numerous members come in and out over the time period that we've been, even before we were officially a working group, and then as we've been a working group, and every contribution was helpful. Some members gave presentations about their own use cases at our meetings. Lots of great conversations that we've had through these plenary sessions, and hope to have more momentarily. Everyone that contributed to the survey, it's all been really helpful in leading up to what we've put together. Re3 data was really also instrumental to the survey for not only helping put that together with us, but also in disseminating it more widely. So everyone has a major role to play that we've interfaced with here. Next slide. So in terms of discussion, I've kind of come up with a few thoughts for myself, but I'm also going to be looking towards the chat, or if you want to raise your hand, you're welcome to do that. I already see there's at least one hand up. And so maybe we'll start there with Sun Young, and I'll let the questions and comments come from the community, and if there's a lull, then I'll bring up some of my own. But Sun Young, you want to go ahead?
Thank you. So this IQA data set for our institutional data repository, and sometimes we get a data set with the multiple, subfolders. So I gave one example, which wasn't a good one because it's restricted access, so you can't see. But I shared it because it was an enormous amount of data. It was close to 30,000, files with the, 30-something folders. But I just shared another one, which is open access, you can see. So this one also has the multiple folders, but I understand the granularity, and it'd be nice if we can assign a different DOI for each maybe subfolder. But I didn't realize there's a cost issue until yesterday when I attended the equity challenge of persistent identifiers, because I never get to see the cost. We are fortunate to not worry about assigning persistent identifiers. So, I don't know how we can address this one. It'd be nice to have, sub-level persistent for this one, but at the same time, a lot of time, like import, for example, has a project level, and but they only assign one DOI. I don't know if it's a cost issue or what. I mean, we did have some discussion about assigning an individual DOI underneath the project. I'm sure weight will be similar. It's a big project, and underneath there'll be a lot of different ones. I assume there'll be, granular level of DOIs under maybe weight or some project level. But how do we balance between cost and the, discoverability in a way?
And so for the cost, I would say, I guess 2 main things. One is that this can vary immensely depending on which consortium that you're part of by country. So, DataCite interfaces with national consortiums, and so in some countries there's maybe a higher body within that country that absorbs that cost, and so then it doesn't actually come down to the same extent to individual repositories, or they're not paying PID by PID. They might be paying, like I know in Canada where I am, the cost to the repository is subsidized by the Digital Research Alliance of Canada, and then each repository pays a smaller amount, but they're lumped into like until you reach 10,000 PIDs per year, it's quite reasonable of a cost. So how a country is distributing the costs to its members can vary. So that's one thing. And then secondly, I would say with that, those subset persistent identifiers within a data set, I know some repositories are using like data site DOIs or other kinds of more universal PIDs for those subsets, but other institutions are using more local identifiers that are still unique within and persistent, but not using a global registry. But they still can locally have that query store with that query information and be able to provide that identifier alongside the higher level data set DOI. So there's different ways that you could do that, and I don't think there's clear consensus on, on that part yet. But Uwe, you might have something to say here. I know you have a lot to say on persistent identifiers.
Yeah, no, about the DOI identifiers, I think the cost problem is also not always really a big problem, because in most cases it's only a problem if you are a very, very small repository that currently only uses one of those lower grades of DOI numbers per year. But once you have reached that limit of 10,000 DOIs per year, then it's more or less a flat rate that you're paying, because then it doesn't really matter anymore how many DOIs you register. So in that case, it's really a good idea if in your country is somebody who registers the DOIs for you in a consortium, then it gets a lot of cheaper. So something like €1 per DOI is long ago. That was at Crossref times at the beginning. Yeah.
Well, even if we would take the cost out of the question, still there's a question remains. Sometimes, like for example, this is all related data set. Do we really need a granular level of DOI for each folder? If it's a big project with the various aspects of a granular level of data set, it makes sense to have an individual DOI, for example, for each folder, for example, which might represent different types of data. But if it's related data, just have many subfolders, is it necessary to assign a PID for individual folder? We can decide what
I agree
is about in the data description, for example. Description of metadata set can provide detailed, description of what each folder means. So that'll help data set discover. But once they, discover the data set, they can see individual folder, and there'll be some description of each folder. Wouldn't that be sufficient?
I would suggest that have a look at the data citation working group outputs. I know it's focused on this concept of dynamic data, but I mean, in reality, most data is dynamic in terms of being versioned and whatnot over time. So, but also it really gets into this notion of subsetting and being able to cite particular subsets. So it could be that there's a real need for to cite at that folder level for the researchers downstream, just to have more precise, identification of what data set what part of the data set that they actually used. So that's something that I think needs to be looked at within like a community by community basis. And so, yeah, whether or not you need to have an actual like DOI associated to each folder, I think that depends on the use case to some extent. But certainly is an important thing to think through. But that idea of having those folders, I would say, is one of those component granularity elements that we talk about. So the ability to subdivide structurally the data set. And then I'm not sure whether or not in the examples that you've given, whether or not they can look at in terms of different dimensions, like, for example, if those image files are taken at different timestamps and they're looking for in a particular time, or what kind of, if they can filter on, like as you say, capturing lower spine, pelvis, and femur, for example, I don't know if they could filter on those particular object, I guess human body parts, which would maybe be a dimension granularity in this particular case. So those kind of notions are what we're getting at, is like, how can the users explore or subdivide the data set? Okay, there's another hand up. Enrique?
Yes, thanks.
I might be saying that wrong, so correct me if I'm saying your
it's
name
fine,
wrong.
Heinrich, it's perfect. Yes, I'm from the German Climate Computing Center in Hamburg. And thank you for this very interesting session and presentation. So this really addressed interesting things. So for example, in climate research, we deal with, especially in the modeling field, with experiments and data collections in the order of petabytes. And I agree. I would say big data collection, the best practice is to assign a DOI. So it depends on the use case in a domain, how, but then not on file level. I would only just, if it's possible, to assign PIDs. So, but then, so actually, if it comes to the reuse, actually, so it's quite important that the discovery is possible on any granulary. So that when the reuser then wants just a small file cut out, he or she has anyway go to the repository, and then there maybe it's enough that then there is a tracking ID, internal ID. And then it's important, but this is another problem. Then there is so one of the speakers addressed then the machine actionability. Then there is, in the best case, it's an automatic mechanism that this granular piece is cut out automatically. So, but this is challenging. And then the second thing I want to address, when we came now to cross-domain discoverability, things get even more difficult. For example, one of the speakers addressed this temporal coverage thing. So, for example, we in one of the discovery interdisciplinary consortium D2Find, we had the facet temporal coverage. And there we tried that the people can zoom in to search for paleo, so for 100 years, 100,000 of years coverage, up to seconds. So that you can zoom, but this was too challenging. So that you have really well, I just want to address that the challenges here get really increasing, so the difficulties here when you come to cross-domain. And yes, just to add this, but thanks for the presentations, and I think we have really make step forwards to get good recommendations as well for the discovery services, as well as for the data producers. So already it starts already if you during to produce the data, if you then produce them in a form that it's already ordered and structured in different granularity levels. Okay, just stop here to continue.
Okay, that's great. And you raise a few points that I'm just gonna elaborate a little bit on. So for example, when you talk about the reuse of the subsets, I think that's important, especially when I'm thinking of the work that Shelley and her team are doing within that complex citation group. It could be that when a reliquary or a collection is being put together, that they want only a subset from another data set, not the entire other subset in that collection or reliquary. So that's very helpful then if that is able to, that they can take that subset out of the original data set and cite it independently of the whole data set and put that information into the collection at that subset level. So being able to reuse at that level. So I think that is important. And then kind of comes back to Sun Young's case, like could be that someone wants just one folder from that data set to reuse in a collection alongside other objects for whatever purpose, a different project or something. And then you also bring up the concept of coverage, and that's also interesting from the point of view of what, well, of course, that comes up in the dimensions that we explored, but also it's really important thing to highlight when we looked at the different schemas in terms of what's possible. So most schemas have that concept of temporal or geographical coverage, but one of the issues is that they're oftentimes not being very giving clear guidance on how to include that information within the field. Like sometimes it's very free form, and then that's very, not interoperable or difficult to utilize in a way to build applications to explore what coverage there actually exists. So I think more clear guidance within those schemas would be necessary to really harness the full value of those fields. And sometimes not everything is even possible to represent in the metadata schema. So for example, DataCite is great because it, in many ways, in terms of the facets we explored, but when we looked at the geographical coverage, there's ability to have, say, latitude, longitude information, but not depth or altitude information. And so if someone was wanting to look at depth in the ocean and using DataCite metadata, they can't get at it that way. So that's perhaps something we need to explore in the adoption phase, is working with some of these metadata schema governance teams to enhance their capabilities within the schemas, or to offer more clear guidance in how to, or recommendations on how to populate these fields. And then that they can be leveraged for better search interfaces that can, utilize these sorts of granularity concepts. Sun Young?
Yeah, I just wanna so I just put a question to Shelley about complex citation. So let's say I really like your idea about taking subset of data and then combine with all the others to present when someone searches for it. Lilliquid might be able to accomplish that, but then would it also allow the provenance, like where the subset of data came from? And I don't know if it's doable with that, PID assigned to these subfolders in a way. So I guess there are multiple questions, and also want to discuss.
As long as the relationship metadata is there, which is also super important.
Relationship metadata. So it's all through the knowledge graph, the metadata. So even without the PID assigned to this subfolder, we can still accomplish. And
I mean, if you had a PID, you can say is part of or has part, and you have those relationships. And then with the reliquary, there's the ability to say it's a part of a collection or a reliquary. So there's things like that, but those relationships are super vital to preserving those lineages.
Really, yeah. So I would like to see the we should be able to go back to where it came from in a way. So
and Sun Young, not every repository supports all of that capability, and not the infrastructure is not consistent yet. Yeah, and it depends on and you're representing institutional repository, which is, we're so glad to see you here at RDA. Welcome. I know it's overwhelming. But discipline-specific repositories who are meeting the needs of that community of researchers have different viewpoints on exactly how much metadata, and then generalist repositories have another viewpoint. So, for instance, the British BODC, British Oceanographic Data Center. So Martina is a co-chair on the complex citation. She's with us here. So is Leslie Wyborn. And they have the ability, because of the way they gather data, to put a handle, which a DOI is just a simple handle with some extra metadata and services, to put a handle identifier on subparts of their data sets. But that's not available for everyone. So it really depends on where you are as a repository and what your researchers need. Think so for Earth and Space Sciences, satellites have massive amounts of data. They are struggling as to where to put those DOIs. And anyway, I could go on. Yeah.
Right. So our institutional data repository is Digital Commons Data, which is the same platform as Mendeley Data, which is one of the great repositories. It's also be a product, so I'm sure Europeans use it as well. And you can actually describe each subfolder, and then that's considered metadata. So I think you can build that kind of relationship and provenance and stuff like that. But I really like the idea of assigning handle to each subfolder if you know, we get more support for that kind of stuff. That's great. Thank you.
Yep. And leaning in on that, publishers sadly only have services for DOIs. They have not yet implemented support for other types of persistent identifiers. But we should not let that stop us, because the more their users, we're users of the journal systems, the more their users have a need and come together and say that need, the implementation is doable. And they also can go back in time and correct linkages. So we should be hopeful.
Right, but the publisher requires, you know, data set availability by depositing a data in a repository and get what they say DOI, but any PID should work. And, you know,
But it doesn't.
No, it doesn't?
It should work, but it doesn't work. The downstream services only recognize DOIs in order for automated attribution to be possible. They don't process anything else but a DOI and a data DOI. And a data DOI, they even are not consistent with it. So, but other people are working on that. So eventually they'll get consistent. But if it's anything else, a handle, a URL, an ascension number, a software heritage number, they don't have services for that, but they do keep it.
That's interesting. Ascension numbers are widely used for sequencing, like a DDDF and GEO, and they don't support that?
I have a paper for you. We could go for hours on this.
Yeah.
I think let me hand it back to Katie. I'll pop the
Yeah,
paper.
Katie has her hand up. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you. And this is really interesting. And I just want to sort of surface one theme I'm sort of hearing that I put in the notes is around, you'll recall we had those categories of sort of types of use: discovery, identification, access, etc. And how I think I was sort of hearing from, it was Heinrich's comment around how you handle granularity may depend upon which type of use it is. And also but there may be a variety within that. So there's an interesting comment in the chat from Alex Ball. I worry about the tendency to try to use the citation model all the way down to the datum level, when all that many use cases require is a mechanism for pinpointing within a cited work. So I'm sort of maybe hearing within that category, there are sort of subcategories, like what is the difference between citation and pinpointing, and when are those activities like require different levels of granularity? So so I feel like that's another level of thinking too, different categories within those. Other questions, people who haven't had a chance to speak or say something?
I just see one of the comments from one of in the chat around would it be appropriate to comment in the notes or other documents? And I just added, yes, please go ahead. So you can see here the link on this slide for the drafts, which will be available for commentary until the end of May. And then we're going to close that off and start the official community review process through the RDA in early June. So that will be the more formalized process towards endorsement. And if you have an interest in being an adopter to these recommendations. We still welcome that perspective from you, so you can contact us directly or post that in the chat or in our collaborative notes, or any way you want to reach us through the landing page of the working group. You can also reach out. So if you're interested in adopting the outputs, that would be really helpful for us as we need to, well, ideally we can include some additional adopters as we put forward this information into the RDA. And then,
and I just want to say my apologies. My computer's being a little odd this morning. I didn't deliberately mean to like advance to this and cut off the Q&A. So you can certainly take more questions. That was an accident on my part.
oh, okay. Well, yeah. So anyways, that spoke to one of the comments or questions in the chat anyway. So that was helpful. And I'm just seeing if there's anything else in the chat here. So Shelley has posted the paper that she was referring to, I think, a minute ago, guidance for software and data citations. So that's great to have a look at that. And I think that's everything from the chat. But yeah, so I mean, I know, yeah, and thank you, Katie, also for expressing the different ways that granularity is applied. So I know we spoke a lot about the citation aspects, which is super important and drove a lot of my own considerations around granularity in the first place, but the discovery element to be able to have the right search interfaces that allow users to query or explore the data via these different granularity components or dimensions, and then to able to retrieve the data at those subset levels as well. So there's a lot of ways for the user to slice and dice the data sets according to their own needs or use cases. And it's true that, like, depending on the community, they might have certain expectations, certain ways of doing things. And so not every repository or search interface needs to do everything. But within a community, we need to look closer at consistency. And actually, that was one of our major findings throughout this work, is that each discipline is still quite different in how it's thinking about granularity. We were hoping, or we were kind of naively imagining that at the end of this working group effort, our final output would actually be a more, you know, guiding way of how you should more precisely define your data set boundaries. And that was clearly not really possible due to differences in disciplines and even within disciplines. So we kind of left it at this more higher level recommendations, but we still think that within a discipline, it could be advantageous to come up with more harmonization about the choices that are being made for applications downstream by aggregators or harvesters, so that they can leverage the metadata more consistently to build more encompassing applications. So that's another important use of granularity, is by the harvesters and the aggregators, and the applications built on data sets beyond the repository itself. So any other comments or questions? Thought I saw a hand. Oh, Remy?
Hi, my name is Remy Cousin. I'm at Columbia University. I manage a platform called the Data Library that has been around for over 25 years in the field of climate science. Regathering and redisseminating mostly data from others around the world in a unified framework, and then allowing data sampling and data transformation before download. So all the things that I've been told there, I'm very familiar with, at least in my field, a bit in other fields as we are doing interdisciplinary work to connect climate with other things. I'm the one who commented that I feel like I've seen only the tip of the the tip of the iceberg, so I don't want to start lengthy conversations on something that is ending. So I guess besides commenting on the notes, my other question is, what are your next steps? And so that I can think better of how I can possibly contribute to those.
So, I mean, the next steps are on this slide in terms of the immediate term, but possibly, Remy, you might be have an opportunity to be an adopter once you take a closer look at the document, and you could perhaps interface with us that way. And the RDA data discovery paradigms interest group, again, initiating the group in the outset, but also is taking on the role of the maintenance plan going forward as things continue to evolve or questions arise or more synergies unfold. So through that maintenance plan, there will be the opportunity to continue to leverage and build upon this work. So that's one option, is through that interest group. I don't know if Katie or Brigitte, you have more to say on that.
No, I think you said it very well.
Okay, well, we're coming to the near end of this with just a few minutes left, and I think we've had a really great conversation about the topic. It's nice to see these outputs finally being realized. We just have a few little, we'll take into account whatever comments that you have over the next week, and then wrap that up so that we can get that into the community review. So thank you for everyone for participating in a very lively discussion today, but also to many of you that participated in previous plenary sessions and our working group meetings and any other kind of dialogue that we've had with you over these last few years. And certainly even the other working groups who weren't even involved directly with us, we've been looking at your outputs and are glad to have had them as a reference point. So thanks to everyone for being such a huge influence for what we've done. And Katie and Brigitte and I are ecstatic to have this finally wrapping up, and but looking forward to where it takes off next. Thanks, everyone.
And thanks to our guest presenters and everyone. Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you.
No problem.
Bye.
Bye.
Hi, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Well, thanks for coming.
Yeah.
Ooh, do we have to kick you out?
No.
Yeah, I know. No, I just wanted bye-bye.
How do we stop the recording?
Let me.
Oh, we need to stop the recording. Okay.
Yes, I'm going to stop screen sharing and then